Hello everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world. Today we are talking about melee weapons and what is the best melee weapon for a Warhammer dwarf. I think there's a particular point here that really shapes the answer, and that, my friends, is context. There's two ways, broadly speaking, I think, of looking at this question. One is looking at it from a very much a tabletop perspective, the advantages or disadvantages you get in the game, and the other is to look at it from perhaps a realism perspective or a lore perspective. I'm going to touch on both of those, and the lore side is going to be a little bit longer, I feel. So, let's begin with the tabletop. Now, although I started playing Warhammer in 4th edition, I only really started playing properly in 6th ed, really going into then 7th and 8th edition of the game. And across those editions, your dwarf clansman, warrior, longbeard really only had two choices when it came to what weapon they would be equipped to fight in hand-to-hand combat with. First is the generic hand weapon, so representing typically for dwarves their hand axes, their hammers, things like that. And the other option being a great weapon. The great weapon in tabletop terms, meaning they're pretty much always striking last, but they're hitting a little bit harder, but also having to sacrifice use of the shield, whereas the hand weapon gives them the opportunity to have a shield as well, that extra armor save, an extra little bit of resilience. Now again, when looking at which of these two weapons is best, context I think again rears its ugly head, and it depends very much on what edition you're playing before you even start thinking about what your local meta looks like. Why do I say this? Well, earlier editions you didn't have random charges, you were charging double your movement range, and charging home was really important for striking first, and there being no step up rule in earlier editions of the game, if you could wipe out the front rank of your enemy's unit before they could fight back, well then you weren't getting fought back, and it gave you a big advantage in winning those combats. So given that dwarves were probably going to be charged rather than carrying out the charges, and even if it came down to initiative, dwarves with low initiatives were almost certainly going to be fighting last, that made a really compelling argument for hand weapon and shield. Depending on the edition, you were looking at 4-up or 3-up save, you're looking at potentially a 6-up parry and run, giving real resilience to your infantry. And of course, by 8th edition, however, all of this changes because we've got bigger units now and we have the step-up rule. So if someone charges into the front of your dwarves, takes out the entire front rank, the next rank will step up and hit them back. And they're going to be hitting them back with great weapons, giving them +2 to their strength, which also gives extra armor piercing capabilities because it was connected to the strength of the hit that came in rather than being a standalone factor. So suddenly dwarves could take the charge, lose a bunch of models, and then hit back incredibly hard, and it became pretty much the default for dwarf units to take great weapons. So in 8th edition, I think there was very much a clear answer to the question, what should you arm your dwarves with? The answer is great weapons. In previous editions, there was more of a question. So what about looking at it from a lore perspective? And a lore perspective opens up a number of options for us. It doesn't just restrict us to this binary choice of Do I give this dwarf a great weapon? Yes or no? It allows us to think about exploring a greater range of weapons. And indeed, if you look at fantasy dwarves in other ranges, in other art and things like that, you see dwarves with weapons other than hand axes or great axes. You see dwarves with swords, you see dwarves with pole arms, spears, things like that. And I think in that there's a lot of stuff that just makes sense. So from this perspective, let's look at our Dwarf Warrior. Our Dwarf Warrior is short, is strong, and is slow moving, relatively, as affected by, in the Warhammer rules, looking at low movement, low initiative. But I think the reach thing here is really important as well. Their arms aren't the longest, they're giving up a lot of distance to their opponent. So if we start by talking about the humble hand weapon, you've just got an axe, a hammer, maybe a small sword or something, you're going to be giving up a lot of reach to virtually every other race out there, certainly anything man-sized or taller that's armed with a similar weapon. And that means the dwarves got to work themselves into range in order to land a shot, whilst their opponent can try and pick them off as they come in from a position of relative safety. Yes, if you've just got a hand weapon, you've probably got a shield as well. You can use that to block lines and try to help close the gap, but it still means you're having to work your way into range from a position of disadvantaged when it comes to the distance, the measure between you and your opponent. So does this mean the obvious answer is great weapon? Well, I'm not so sure that it is. There's an element of sacrificing protection when it comes to using great weapons. Now, in small confined spaces, particularly if you're fighting in whole passageways and things like that, where dwarves may well be in the old remnants of their holds, is there even room to properly swing the thing? It's, potentially a challenge there. And if you look at the sort of great weapons we see typically modelled on these fantasy models, they're not actually huge. They're not giving the longest reach to our dwarf. They're giving it a bit more hitting power, absolutely. They're mitigating to some extent the issues of shorter arms, but they're not going as far as they could do with that. So that brings us on to other weapon types and the kind of weapons we see way back editions of Warhammer. There's definitely been models of dwarves armed with other kinds of weapons, and other gaming systems we see as well, such as Kings of War. What do I mean? Well, things like spears, pole arms. Now, pole arms make, I think, a reasonable amount of sense when we're looking at dwarves, particularly if we're looking at something like a halberd or a bill. It's a versatile weapon. You can chop, you can stab, you can hook. It's a pole weapon. It's longer. It gives you a lot more reach. To an extent, actually, a dwarf armed with a pole weapon will probably have mitigated, if not more than mitigated, any reach disadvantage over a hand weapon equipped human size foe. The shoe may even be on the other foot, with the dwarf having a slight reach advantage. Now, a halberd or bill can be used to generate some real force and hit hard. Certainly, because of the physics involved, they'll be hitting harder than just a hand axe or a normal hammer. It's probably worth noting at this point, actually, however, that of course axes and hammers, and they're like made for combat situations and not going to be as heavy as those used for domestic tasks such as chopping wood, etc. Axe heads are thinner, that the lighter the axe is going to move quicker, so that's still a thing to bear in mind, but an aside. And that leads me to really talk about spears. So yes, they're sort of a pole weapon, and spears are a weapon that's been used historically by pretty much every warrior culture that's ever existed. Alright, they've been used in different ways and in different forms, but spears have always been there. And I think they make a lot of sense for dwarves, because not only do they give you the reach element to it, they actually can be used quite quickly and nimbly. So they can be used to keep an opponent back, keep them at distance, and then deliver a well-aimed thrust when the need arises. They can be used with a shield. You don't have to forego that protection in the way that you do with a weapon that takes two hands to use effectively, or big swinging motions. So a great axe, great hammer, you're not going to use a shield with that. Realistically, a weapon like a halberd, again, you're not going to be using a shield in close combat. A spear, you can use that shield, and if it's got loops on at the back rather than just a handle, you can have both hands free, certainly the front hand free, to just guide to with the power being generated from the backhand. You've got a nimble weapon, you've got one with good reach, and one that can be used in a close formation with shields, giving you lots of protection, particularly against things like cavalry, which would be reluctant to charge into a mass of dwarves stood behind a spiky fence. Now, the logical expansion onto spears is to touch on pikes, and we know again from looking historically that coming from a traditionally mountainous area isn't enough to say pikes shouldn't be a thing, because let's face it, Swiss mercenaries with pikes were famous during the Renaissance for their effectiveness. But they were still weapons being used predominantly in the open field of battle, and I think that's not somewhere a dwarf necessarily wants to be when they're fighting. They're probably more likely to be fighting in underground conditions or cramped positions. So that doesn't mean they don't take to the open field, of course they do, and a pike would be useful there. But from a practical perspective, I think it may be a little bit of a bridge too far, certainly given the logistics of them, the unwieldy nature of pikes. Now, I say about using a pike in underground, cramped, tunnel sort of conditions. Would that affect a spear? To a certain extent, yes, it would. But a much shorter weapon that you can actually shorten your grip on as well, depending on circumstances, it is still a more viable weapon. And again, it's something that can be backed up as well by a hand weapon, so you can always drop the spear and pull out something else as well as a sidearm, which is what hand weapons, your single hand weapon, is really. It's a sidearm, it's a backup. So fundamentally, from a law and realism perspective, I think the spear makes a lot of sense for a dwarf. And, well, there's a reason that every military culture has used a spear to some extent. It's a cheap weapon, but one that can be used very effectively and would certainly support the more defensive fighting style of the dwarves. What do you think then listener, do you have a particular favourite weapon that you like to stick on your drawers? Do you think it should be such a binary choice as great weapon or hand weapon when it comes to the tabletop game? Do you think there should be other options available? Do you have a particular favourite weapon for your drawers? Let me know all of this in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed listening to my thoughts on this topic, do consider subscribing. It is the best way of keeping track of my videos as and when they become published. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening so far. I'm returned to the old world. Have a great day.